Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you this evening from Gadigal country here in Australia, and I wanted to start by paying my respects to Gadigal elders, past, present, and emergent, and also to Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. I live and I work on lands that were taken without treaty, compensation, or consent, lands that remain to this day stolen lands, but also lands of ongoing Indigenous survivance, resilience, and continuance. Thank you so much, Justin and the fellow organizers, for inviting me to participate in this rippling river of shared thinking, listening, knowing, not knowing, and most importantly, speaking from the heart. I'm also really delighted to be in conversation with Kat Maria. Thank you so much for being here. And I really, yes, I'm enchanted by the prospect of conversing with you. And more generally, I'm looking forward to navigating with all of you these complex ebbs and flows of possibility for imagining and enacting decolonized, just and empathic ways of reworlding together in an age of radical planetary unraveling. So the themes of the half hour or so presentation I'm going to give will include, damages of colonial capitalism, ways of developing better relations together and across difference, both human and other than human difference, and trying to think about forging ways of, or other ways of being in and of the world that are less violent and more just. And the key inspiration that really lies at the heart of what I want to present are the philosophies, practices, and protocols of Indigenous Marind in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua, whom I've had the immense privilege of working with and learning from over the course of the last decade. So Marind communities have, in the last 10 years or so, seen vast areas of their customary lands and forests converted to monocrop oil palm plantations. These transformations are radically reconfiguring their intimate and ancestral relationships to one another and to non-human beings and elements, from plants and animals and soils to waters, atmospheres, and more. What I want to try to do in this presentation, drawing from Indigenous ways of being and knowing, is to rethink capitalism and colonialism as a multi-species story, one that is human, but also human not only, in the sense that relations, empathy, care, and possibly also justice are very much understood by Marind as practices that operate across species lines in a much more perhaps capacious, inclusive, expansive, and relational sense than individual-centric, human-centric Western paradigms of justice and of personhood. So the paper I want to give will be very ethnographic. I'm going to try to do justice to the stories and theories of change that have been entrusted to me by my companions in West Papua. And I try to also zoom out from there to sort of touch on some broader concepts, ideas, and ethics that we might try to cross-pollinate in our own worlds, whilst also, of course, acknowledging, the ways in which we are always already complicit in always impure and uninnocent worlds. The talk I'm giving today, I also want to dedicate to a friend, Victor Yemo, who is a prominent independent activist in West Papua, who has been incarcerated since the 10th of May for a simple act, raising the Morning Star flag, which is the Papuan flag, an act that is punishable by 15 years in jail under Indonesian law. Okay, so we're traveling now to the villages of Muting, Kindiki, and Boha, where that red dot is on the map there. The villages are located in the West Papuan district of Merauke, and they are the place where I spent the better half of a year living among Indigenous Marind communities who number around 600 households in the area. So back in 2015, when I started my fieldwork in Merauke, the government had allocated some 2 million hectares of land in the area to 36 domestic and international corporations for the development of oil palm, timber, and sugarcane plantations. Vast swaths of forest had been felled or burned. Major watercourses had been diverted to irrigate the newly established monocrops. Many of the settlements in the area were encircled by oil palm plantations that covered several hundreds of thousands of hectares of former forest and extended north into the neighboring district of Bofendigul. With dozens more companies applying for operational permits, agribusiness continued to expand across the region. This image here is a piece of drone footage that I took when I was in the field, and I think kind of gives you a sense of the scale of the destruction that's taking place in the area. So in the spirit of the reflexivity and sharing that this session and event is organized from, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a sense of my own personal trajectory and encounter with difference among Marind in its many guises. So when I first visited Merauke in 2011, as Justin noted, I was working as a project officer for a Forest Peoples program. At the time, I was undertaking field investigations together with local NGO partners and the church to document the social and environmental impacts of oil palm developments in Merauke. These investigations revealed that agribusiness projects were being designed and implemented without Marind's free, prior, or informed consent. Consultations, when undertaken, tended to present projects as a fait accompli and offered limited information to communities on the potential risks to their local food security, land rights, and livelihoods. Military corporate collusion was also rampant, and oil palm projects were often framed in corporate and government rhetoric as key to national interests, regional economic growth, and importantly, to the development of West Papuans into modern civilized subjects. However, employment opportunities for Marind were often limited, as the companies preferred to bring in their own labor force from other parts of the archipelago or hire non-Papuan migrants. Other grievances that were shared by Marind included unfulfilled corporate social responsibility schemes, critical water pollution, endemic biodiversity loss, and deforestation, often through illegal burning. So the dispossessory dynamics of agribusiness that I just described were not radically dissimilar to what I had witnessed in many other parts of Indonesia, and particularly in Sumatra and Kalimantan. But the particular ways in which the dispossession was being experienced on the ground was different. Very early on, I was struck by how Marind conceptualized the arrival of oil palm. The stories I heard in the field were not about global markets, corporate interests, or food security, nor did they revolve primarily around the issue of rights, land, human, or indigenous. Instead, cryptic statements abounded in my companions' reflections on their present condition, which were invariably preceded by the temporal marker since oil palm arrived, setelah sawit datang. Oil palm, people would tell me, was a modern totem that had made time come to a stop. The forest, they said, had become a world of straight lines, haunted by a rapacious and foreign plant being. People told stories of cassowaries and crocodiles turning into plastic and weeping like humans as their native habitats disappeared. At night, oil palm was said to deplete the flesh and fluids of dreamers in their sleep. Meanwhile, the skin of animals and plants was drying out as oil palm sapped wetness from the earth and devoured the forest. These narratives that I heard in the field challenged my activist habitus. They also stimulated my curiosity. Eventually, they brought me to leave the world of human rights advocacy and undertake long-term fieldwork among Marind in Merauke. Oil palm's expansion, I came to realize, could not be framed as either a social or an ecological problem, nor could it be addressed purely through the discourse of human rights or environmental justice. The expansion of oil palm was radically reconfiguring Marind's sense of place, time, and personhood, their bodies, their stories, even their dreams. It affected men, women, and children, both present and to come, who, together with forest creatures, appeared to be going a more than human existential crisis, one that left no single sphere or species of life untouched. NGOs, including the one that I worked for, targeted the Indonesian government, international corporations, and financial investors in their anti-palm oil campaigns. And yet, the communities whose rights we advocated seemed more interested in oil palm itself, where it comes from, what it wants, how it differs from native species, and more importantly, why it is so destructive. Answering these questions about multi-species world I discovered require taking seriously, as many Marind do, the attributes of non-human beings, like plants, as particular kinds of agents, and as members of shared communities of fate in the face of capitalist incursions. Of course, Marind are acutely aware of the human and institutional forces driving oil palm expansion across their lands and territories. And yet they do not conceive oil palm only as a passive object of human exploitation, nor as a sessile instrument of capitalist gain. Rather, their speculation over oil palm's affects and effects arises from the fact that the plant itself is seen as a willful entity and consequential protagonist, one that is voracious, destructive, and alien, but that is also a source of pity and compassion. So what I'll do in the rest of the talk is present to you the various facets of this changing marine life world as, again, a multi-species story, one in which plants, animals, and landscapes too have a voice and count as consequential protagonists. A good place to start thinking about multi-species worlds and unworldings is place. Marind often described to me the forests, savannas, and swamps of their territories as being alive, or hidup, with the movements of both humans and their plant and animal kin, whom they refer to as amai, or sibling. Amai here refer to animals and plants with whom different marine clans share common descent from ancestral spirits, or dema, and whom they consider both sentient and agentive. It's the relationships of marine clans to these plant and animal siblings that determines the location and extent of their respective customary land rights. All clans may travel, hunt, and gather outside their territories so long as they seek permission from the land-owning clan and carry out the required rituals towards its plant or animal amai. And often the land boundaries would follow the trajectories of plants and animals through the landscapes. For instance, the places where these species were created by ancestral spirits, the sites of their meaningful encounters in the past and in the present. Some boundaries would follow the proliferation of plants, such as sago groves, coconut palm clusters, and bamboo forests. Other boundaries were enlivened by the actions of animals. For instance, the mound where the dog Amai napped along the Bian River, the bend of the streams where the Kasuari Amai laid its first egg, or the soil depression where the heron Amai nursed its broken wing before flying west to Kondo, home of the deceased. Plants and animals are consistently tracing new paths of life across the landscape as they grow, migrate, propagate, and seek out subsistence. And in turn, customary land boundaries shift as these more than human communities of life expand and contract across space. And it's these flowing paths of humans, animals, and plants that participate in a sort of shared wayfaring, producing the environment through an interagentive dwelling. Today, however, new kinds of infrastructures are being superimposed on the moral multi-species topography of the forest and its lively beings. These include roads, military garrisons, cities, and more recently, oil palm plantations. And I'll focus only here on the meanings of oil palm plantations. In many ways, these new topographies for Marind are profoundly ambivalent. Plantations are pregnant with particular kinds of promise at the same time as they restrict or subvert the relationships and movements of human and non-human beings that make the landscape alive. For instance, for many Marind, plantations come with the promise of material wealth, community welfare, and local employment. Companies design CSR schemes to improve local education and village infrastructure and provide compensation packages for land ceded. Some offer casual jobs to Marind as fruit harvesters, drivers, and security guards. Many Marind who I worked with support the palm oil sector in these capacities and see themselves as contributing to regional economic growth and national food security. At the same time, however, Marind's mobility has been radically undermined by the relentless expansion of monocrops around their villages. Entrances to the concessions is strictly forbidden to non-personnel, whereas in the past, Marind traveled easily into Papua New Guinea to visit their relatives. The national border has now become a militarized oil palm frontier. Just as importantly, land clearing to make way for oil palm means that there is increasingly less forest for Marind to go to. Remnant patches are often located far from the villages, such that foraging expeditions now only take place on average 2 to 3 times a year. And many of these trips were cut short by the arrival of bulldozers, chainsaw-wielding laborers, and plantation security patrols, or also the ominous buzz of pesticide spraying helicopters overhead. But it is not only Marind who are affected by plantation proliferation. Oil palm monocrops, dominated by a single plant, also put pressure on native flora and fauna by creating impervious barriers to species migration across land and water. Few species can thrive in oil palm ecologies that are characterized by low canopies, sparse undergrowth, unstable microclimates, high temperatures, and a toxic melange of chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Many Marind would talk about plants and animals as having been robbed or starved of their water, nutrients, and symbiotes. Wild pigs and cassowaries, for instance, that venture into the plantation to feed on oil palm fruit are often hunted down by plantation workers for consumption or trade. People would point out to me the bamboo clusters and sago groves that had collapsed as the soil was depleted of its minerals. In the plantation, too, the call of birds and beasts were being replaced by a deathly silence, one that was particularly eerie in the glaring heat of the midday sun. In the plantation, my companions would often tell me, sounds of life are replaced by sounds of death. Roaring bulldozers, gnawing chainsaws, the crackle of illegal burning, and the rumble of overloaded oil palm fruit and timber trucks. Closely linked to the way in which oil palm expansion affects place is the way that it reshapes personhood. So for many Marind, personhood is a deeply embodied aspect of self, in the sense that it manifests in one's skin and wetness. So by skin, I literally mean the surface of the body, and by wetness, I refer to blood, flesh, to muscle, tears, sweat, and all kinds of other bodily fluids. A person who is a good person, one who entertains good relationships with other humans and with the forest, can be known from their glossy skin and abundant wetness. And to enhance their skin and wetness, it's imperative to spend time in and with the forest ecology, exchanging skin and wetness with plants and animals whose wetness takes the form of pith, riverine waters, the sap of trees, the grease and flesh of animals, and so forth. The introduction of oil palm in the last decade is often in turn associated by Marind with a depletion and impoverishment of human and non-human skin and wetness. People, for instance, would talk about oil palm occupying the land, water, and life of forest beings, sapping their fluids and wounding their skin, but giving nothing in return. As oil palm encroaches onto the forest, the skin or surface of the river was stripped of its vegetation through deforestation and burning. It became dry, flaky, and wizened. Trucks that carry oil palm fruit bunches to the mill, along with the bulldozers clearing the forest, were often criticized for digging deep tread marks, or what Marind called scars, on the surface of the soil. Water supplies, too, were being depleted as plantation irrigation diverted or arrested the flow of ancestral rivers. The skin of the Bian River, for instance, was said to be no longer shiny and sleek, but rather mottled and grey. Marind and their forest kin thus inherit in their very flesh the excesses of capitalism and its toxic externalities. As he watched the bulldozers crashing through the forest, Antonius, a young man in his 20s, pointed to the cracked skin of his calves and commented that oil palm was leaving humans, mangroves, and beasts parched. The wizened skin of the forest, he said, could no longer sustain the diverse plants and animals that Marind share relatedness with and depend on for their subsistence. Their bodies, once strong and glossy, become weak and dry as fertile soils fritter into dust. The ashes produced by the burning of the forest skin, too, are particularly significant to Marind. These ashes scatter as sediment across the landscape. They are the ephemeral traces of once living kindred species that eventually settle in the respiratory tracts and lungs of humans and animals in a deeply macabre form of particulate cannibalism. A third way in which oil palm is reconfiguring Marind's multi-species life world is through its impacts on time. When I was doing my fieldwork in Merauke, there was a very prevalent statement among local villagers, which was that since oil palm had arrived, time had come to a stop. So when Marind talk about oil palm having made time come to a stop, they're situating this temporal rupture within a much longer history of colonial capitalist incursions that have gradually broken down the temporal relations between humans, the landscape, and its other than human inhabitants. The first temporal rupture, they told me, which made time slow down, was the arrival of foreign plume traders and hunters during the pre-colonial era, who came and depleted local bird of paradise populations. The second moment when time slowed down was during Dutch colonization, when enforced missionization, sedentarization, and the abolishment of customary rituals and interclan exchanges brought all kinds of revered relationships to the environment and the forest to a halt. The third slowing down of time occurred after Indonesian settler colonization, which was accompanied by a massive influx of migrants, as well as corporations and extractive industries, gold, timber, logging, and many more. For many Marind, the arrival of oil palm is the most recent and dramatic disruption in their conception and experience of time. As plantations expand, a plant being of singular growth and singular form is replacing the diversely rhythmic and intersecting life cycle that enlivened the forest. For instance, the call of birds that marked the break of dawn, the fall of night, and seasonal transitions have become rare. The times of fruit maturation, bird and animal migration, and fish and amphibian reproduction too seem to have halted indefinitely. As it takes over the grove and forest, oil palm is therefore severing the shared temporalities of growth, reproduction, and senescence of Marind and their more than human kin. In doing so, plantations are erasing the spatially experienced past of human and more than human beings that are physically embodied in the textures of the landscape. This in turn forestalls the possibility of a meaningful present and also thwarts the shared futures of the forest's dwindling communities of life. Finally, I want to talk about dreams. Alongside the statement that oil palm had made time come to a stop was a new sort of experience that was becoming increasingly prevalent among the villagers whom I was working with. And this is an experience that Marind would talk about as being eaten by oil palm, or the makan sawit. These are a form of dream, a sort of nocturnal possession. As I said, the experiences of dreams of being eaten by oil palm increased dramatically in frequency during my time in Merauke. In the last few months, villagers would travel up and down the river and across settlements almost every day to hear and share their experiences of being eaten by oil palm with kin and friends. In the villages, often the fall of darkness was shrouded with restless apprehension. People would talk for hours in half whispers about what torment the night might bring and to whom. Then at the break of dawn, nebulous dream narratives would disperse across homes and hearths as those who had been eaten by oil palm would reveal the harrowing deeds and deaths that had been conjured in their sleep. So what are these dreams of being eaten by oil palm? Well, in brief, they are uncanny and dystopic. During these experiences of being eaten, human bodies, those of the dreamers, become disfigured by oil palm fruit that proliferate subcutaneously like cancerous tumors. Some people talked about razor-edged palm thorns incubating between their sinews and muscle, perforating their skin like arrows shot out from the viscous entrails of their writhing bodies. Marind women eaten by oil palm told me of suffering tortured child labors, deadly hemorrhages, ripped wombs, and eventually the birthing of monstrously deformed and thorny fresh fruit oil palm bunches, or what they called oil palm children, some alive, others stillborn. In these dreams, Marind see their plant and animal kin and also their deceased relatives appear alongside soldiers, bulldozers, charred sago groves, polluted rivers, and of course, oil palm. Almost all of these dreams take place in the darkness of nights that never end, as many Marind put it, whose deafening silence is interrupted only by screams or gunshots. Many of my companions spoke of having experienced heightened sensations of fear, pain, loneliness, and panic, along with a very disturbing loss in motility and spatial cognition in these dreams. And most dramatically, they would talk about witnessing and experiencing not only their own deaths repeatedly, but also the deaths of multiple other forest beings whose existence, like their own, is jeopardized by agribusiness expansion. So in many ways, these dreams are amplifying the existing distortions and disruption that capitalist incursions are causing on the physical and material landscape that Marind inhabit. So there's a really clear sense for many of these stories that for Marind, oil palm is a consequential protagonist in the story of capitalism, in the sense that it has agency and exerts effects on the ecology that it replaces. For many Marind, oil palm is a destructive, rapacious, self-interested being. But that's not the whole story. At the same time as many Marind deeply resent oil palm for its devastating effects and self-interested proliferation, many of my friends also expressed deep-seated pity and compassion towards this plant in light of its own exploitation at the hands of humans, institutions, and machines. So for instance, when I explained to my friends the palm oil production process, many of them would interrupt me to deplore the fact that every stage of oil palm's growth is determined by human agents. The temporality of the plant's existence is subjected to countless biological and technological manipulations that regulate its development, form, and uses, all the way from seedling to commodity. Villagers will talk about the plant having been violently artificially bred through controlled pollination and its fertility and yields boosted with a range of toxic chemical fertilizers to achieve corporate targets of production. Villagers that visited the palm oil mill would describe how palm oil was being forced out of oil palm's body through high heat, high pressure processes of mechanical extraction. And they would list these forms of violences in these sort of litanies of terms: sterilization, threshing, steaming, mulching, boiling, cracking, stripping, winnowing, crushing, diluting, purifying, clarifying, fractionating, churning, pressing, and more. Seedlings too were an object of great pity and compassion, particularly among Marind women. Seedlings that fail to achieve yield targets set by corporations are often culled en masse. Meanwhile, trees that are unproductive or diseased undergo a radical dismembering. They are felled, defronded, chipped, and stacked by the mandibles of trunk shredders, pulverized to shreds in just under 4 minutes. Oil palm seeds and also the fruit bunches were a particular object of discussion among Marind women. The seeds that they often talked about as children, they would describe as having been violently uprooted and transported to Merauke from distant places in trucks and boats. These seeds, they said, grow in sanitized plastic bags and industrial nurseries, not in their native ecologies. In addition, the life of these seeds is perpetuated once the tree stops bearing fruit and it is felled. Many of the women will talk about how oil palm fruit also, the bunches from which the oil is extracted, would be ripped from the parent palms every 10 to 15 days during the harvesting and then unceremoniously flung into overloaded trucks like dead bodies for transport to the mill. What would happen to these fruit in the mill remained for many a mystery. People would only see dark chugging smoke, trucks driving back and forth at all hours of the night and day, and finally, the deep red crude palm oil extracted from the fruit, which some of my friends called oil palm's blood, darasawit. Alongside compassion and pity for the plant is curiosity. Many of my friends pondered at length over where oil palm's native home is. It was introduced to West Papua, who its kin are back in its native ecologies, and what relations it sustains with human and non-human beings in these native soils. My friends were often speculated about oil palm's multi-sided flows as part, plant, and product across dispersed global channels of provision, distribution, and accumulation. They would often ask me how the plant had traveled from its native Africa all the way to West Papua. Some were fascinated by how oil palm had managed to spread so successfully across almost half the globe. And there was a particular interest here when it came to the actual scientific name of oil palm itself, Eleus guineensis, which literally means the olive of Guinea. Many of my companions were fascinated by this potential connection between the native Guinea, African Guinea, from where oil palm comes, and their own island of New Guinea, thinking through this as potential connections between both the plants and the peoples of these two spaces. So I want to end with a few overarching thoughts. What I've tried to do in sort of fleshing out these multiple facets and dimensions of the story of oil palm's arrival in Marind lands is to sort of highlight the ways in which these are multi-species stories, right? Both in terms of their impacts and in terms of their actors. And perhaps most interesting to this story is the multiple and hugely complex ways in which Marind theorize and conceptualize oil palm itself. a plot which is so radically undermining their ways of being, becoming, and belonging, but one that is also a subject of pity, compassion, curiosity, and desire. I think this capacity to live with or to stay with the trouble of multiple affective, moral, and ethical dispositions is really, really key here. It's never about one thing alone. It's always about this multiplicity of perspectives and affective stances that is really at the heart of Marind philosophies of capitalism and its vegetal protagonists. Thinking with being, becoming, and belonging is something I'd love to engage with all of you on. I'm assuming these are themes that have also come out in other sessions. You know, there are ideas of nativity, introduction, what belongs, what doesn't, what can be introduced and become kin, what is introduced and will always remain alien colonist. You know, Marind are thinking with these ideas of belonging and longing, right? I think both are at play. The question of what kind of world they long for and what kind of justice, you know, Opam itself might long for are key to this story. And I think untangling those relationships of being, becoming, and belonging could be a really useful, yes, entry point into rethinking what it means to world together, yeah, otherwise and more wisely. And finally, empathy and justice. These are two concepts that I've been thinking with a lot more recently. I think is very much sort of work in progress. But this capacity that Marind have, you know, this incredible capacity to empathize with destructive beings that embody very much the forces of colonial capitalism, in this case, OPAM, I think is something that's challenging, but also necessary. It's a form, for me, a form of radical care, to borrow the words of the Hawaiian scholar Haile Hobart. Haile talks about radical care as the refusal not to care, even for beings that are disruptive, that are you know, dispossessory, that are colonizing, to push care beyond the bounds of that which can be loved, that which is relatable, I think is a challenge, and I think one that is, yeah, important to think with as part of getting by in these increasingly terrifying times. And finally, justice, again, something which Marind certainly think about in more than human terms, even as they are themselves ongoingly treated as subhuman and killable before the law. Particularly, you know, we've seen this heightened in the last few months. So I think, you know, I'd love to engage with all of you on questions of justice beyond, you know, within, but also beyond juridical legal framings of what justice is, of what a just relationship to the natural world might entail, whether there are forms of justice outside of, you know, justice with a capital J, everyday, mundane forms of justice that we can enact in our own consumer lives and relationship to the environment. And I think these questions for me are particularly important, given that so much of my thinking with Marind has been about Opam, palm oil, a plant that is, yes, with us all in all different kinds of ways in our own daily lives here, with whom we are complicit, you know, that is implicit in so many ways, a sort of shapeshifter of the Anthropocene. And so I'd love to think with you about, yes, doing justice across scales, across sites, and across, you know, ethical stances, practical labors, and also affective dispositions. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That's really fantastic talk. Maria, I know that you're going to have to go at some point, so really start from anywhere you like in terms of responding, or start from somewhere entirely different, wherever you like. So over to you.
Wow, yeah, thank you. And Sophie, thank you. It was very, very impressive research piece, and very empowering. I want to, I think I am going to use this opportunity to share personally how this story affects me and how this similar story means to me, and to what I do exactly. So when my mother first came back to Wambi, she was born in Okaba. Sophie has been there, and she was growing up in a village next to Okaba. It's a small, tiny village called Wambi. And when she came back, after 50 years nearly of being away, when she first stepped into the village, there was a man, her friends from her childhood welcomed her on the door of, you know, the gate of the village. And the moment he saw her, he called her Mboke. My mom's name is Wilhelmina, but the person in that village, her friend from her childhood called her Mboke. And all the young people who never knew her, watching that welcoming, suddenly, you know, they all together say, Ayua. I don't know what's the word in Indonesia, but it's like, oh, you know, that all together, like a choir. Ayua. Mboke is a bat. And that was the first time my mom heard someone say it out loud to her face. Mboke. And that's the time when my mom started to go back to herself and think about, who am I? Rethink about who am I? And that process started to take her back to reclaim herself. I was growing up embedding this intergenerational trauma caused by colonization in different forms, in many different forms, especially the way I see myself. I was growing up with stories that Sophie mentioned in her research. I was growing up listening to, my mom said to me, oh, that dog is not really a dog. It's someone turned to become a dog. You know, you just wait. In the morning, that dog won't be there and it will never come back. So I was growing up familiar to, you know, really, really familiar with that kind of story. And that's why when I see Sophie's, you know, talking about this, I was like, wow, this is so familiar to me. And finally, someone talked about it as a research piece. So it's something, it's how, to me, it's how personal becomes political. How I see myself in this, across the spectrum of colonization in different level. But what I'm trying to address here is the colonizations of myself and my process of liberating myself from that trauma, heal myself from that trauma, is the process of liberation that all Papuans must have gone through. Naming the trauma and work on it. Reclaiming self and be proud of it. We are survivors and we have to be proud of that. Despite all the destructing forces or the killing power, we survive. How can we tell the stories of being a survivor? How can we tell a story of how proud we are of being a survivor? And that has been my question of my inquiry in my journey of becoming. How can I reclaiming myself, naming my trauma and work on it? How can I say stand up, and instead of saying I am the victim of Indonesian government colonization, change the narrative. I am a survivor, and for that I am proud. And that has been my work for the last 20 years, since I came back home and started the work with community and with the people. And just recently, about 10, 12 years ago, I started to then be more focused and apply this popular education and critical conscientization in the area of trauma healing. How can I be able to bring up this collective unconscious? Sophie talks a lot about dreams and fear that comes out consequently from this process, from these generations of colonizations. How can we encourage a process whereby all Papuan community groups have a regular, systematic storytelling to talk about their dreams, to bring that collective unconscious to the surface, make it real. And I think that's how I would like to see this work, going forward. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's absolutely wonderful too. Thank you both. Really such rich and complementary and different at the same time, which is such a richness to be different and to be the same and to be pointing to the same thing in different ways. Don't know if either of you want to speak to each other. I know that Maria, you have to go on the hour because you're still working somewhere else, but if you want to converse at all, do, and then we'll go to breakout groups. Sophie, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Terima kasih banyak, Kak Maria. Thank you so much for this, for gifting us with your own, lifelong journey of that question of reclaiming the I and asking who am I? I think it's a relational question in so many ways. And I wanted to ask you this powerful, you were talking about the importance of naming the trauma and not only telling damage-centered stories, but also talking about resilience and survivance and creativity and the indigenization of colonialism and capitalism by indigenous Papuans in incredibly complex and sophisticated and I think politically powerful ways. And for Marind, mourning and dukkha, grieving for forests that had been destroyed was such a big part of reclaiming a future and hope, in the sense you can only look forward by commemorating or grieving those who have departed as a result of these environmental transformations. So trauma therapy was noken, weaving in the forest. It was singing together with the mama in the sago grove. It was stopping your motorbike by the road when there was, snake that had been trampled by the trucks or the 4x4s and making a prayer, or some show of respect, a pausing, a stopping, a reckoning with destruction in order to move on and to continue reclaiming and recreating and rebuilding solidarity. And I would love to hear more about, yes, this idea of claiming the trauma, and how the kind of practices, the practical ways in which you and your communities and are doing that work of reclaiming trauma.
Yeah. In the process of critical conscientizations, stories matters. And the process here, what we've been through, is to be able, you mentioned that very clearly, Sophie, and thank you for that, because I just suddenly remember. Grief and mourn in Indigenous society is part of daily life. And that is something that I find working on storytelling is something very critical. And we all know trauma healing is not basically, it's not an easy process. It's not something that we can see the results overnight, that can be put into a logical framework for proposal. The moment you say to donor, we are doing trauma healing, and the donor will be like, what? No. So this is, it is a long process. And in the area of liberation psychology, even, this is quite relatively new area of explorations, because in a mainstream psychology, we tend to deal with individual trauma and not really working on collective trauma, especially collective trauma as a result of colonization and injustices. So without going too much details about how I do this or how we work on this, but one thing that I learned a lot in the last 10 years or so is basically using a lot of storytelling and the process of enabling community to self-analyzing, rather than having someone sitting there and analyze things for them. But how can we actually work and help them to analyze their lives, be proud and claim something that they're doing good without having to feel ashamed of, or having to regret what they have gone through. Because mourning and grieving is different to being regretful, or it is different to regretting. And I think, I don't know if that answers your question, Sophie, but that's how, yeah, I see it.
That's so powerful, and it makes me think of the words of one of my friends when we were talking about why mourning matters, and he said to me, there's only one thing worse than death, and it's the death of mourning. The day when we no longer know how to mourn, and mourning is dead, then we are really in trouble. And for me, that was very powerful, that, yeah, Papuans are doing something with and of grief. It's an active grieving. It's a pathway to something else. And yeah, that idea of there is something worse than death, and it's the death of mourning itself, I think speaks a lot to everything you've just described. So thank you for that.
Wow. Thank you both so much. You both brought out so much in each other. It's just wonderful. Really huge appreciation to you both. Really, I feel very moved.
Can I ask a question? I don't know to whom, but maybe also to Eva and Justin, coming from the line we were speaking yesterday about trauma, collective trauma as a politic issue. And I was wondering, because this for me, it's really difficult subject and complex. Crossing what has been said here now about the trauma of the survivors that are proud of being survivors. I like that idea. But this is one part of the trauma here. And when I remember what was said yesterday about the way we do politics. I'm not speaking about general citizens, but the politic ones in democratic countries, let's say capitalism, etc. And not even only that, but I would like to hear from you the connection or whatever it is about the trauma of the survivor or those that are impacted by politics, that from what you said yesterday also come from trauma, for traumatized people, that if they were not traumatized, they would never do such a thing because they are blind, they are numbed, etc., etc. And could you, I don't know, explore a little bit about those both sides of trauma? It's not the same trauma for sure, but it seems, what I understand yesterday, that you look at them as being linked. And I have difficulties for this. Can you explore a little bit the idea? I don't know if I was clear enough. So
it sounds to me like it's the how, if and how the trauma of those in power is connected with those who are survivors of the destruction. That
yes, because I think I got this idea from you too, Justin and Eva, yesterday, and I have difficult to enter in it. So I use the opportunity to hear from you now with this practical example.
Yeah, and I'd also be really interested in Maria and Sophie.
Yeah, of course, we both too.
But really briefly from me, yeah, it is really complex, and I think that for me it's to do with the stranglehold that the culture of domination has on nearly everybody, and it does have and it starts when we're tiny, and you know the people who are now in positions of power at one point were little babies who were being left alone, little boys in general who were being sent to school and beaten, and told that they weren't worthwhile unless they were standing up for themselves in particular ways, and expressing themselves in particular ways. So there's a lot of energy that goes into creating those very controlled shells that those people live within. And I don't think for a minute that we should just feel sorry for them and let them carry on. I think it's really essential that we feel sorry for them and take them out of the positions that they're in and really not let them back into them, because they've been very damaged. But there is damage, and I think it's important to acknowledge that this system of domination strangles our humanity wherever we are in the horrible pecking order that it creates. So that's how I would see it being connected. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything from Maria or Sophie as well, or Justin.
No. I think pass it back to Sophie and then Maria, I'd suggest.
I just want to, I suppose it's such a big and important question, and I think any critical approach to the topics we're discussing demands that we also attend to that other side of trauma seen from the other perspective. I mean, I think I'll let Maria speak more to it because you're in such a more interesting position to speak to it from, but I think, you know, for me, having done research in West Papua, it's a part of the world that many people that I know don't know that West Papua exists. They think that it's part of Papua New Guinea. The number of times where I've been, you know, people have thought I work across the border. So there's an incredible, ignorance of what's happening in West Papua in many global communities. And I think that's why when we tell and share stories, those are always political and personal decisions, right, Maria? And for me to focus on the trauma of Papuans has been must, I think, be read contrapuntally to the general apathy and a lack of understanding of knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground in this particular part of the world, and that is not a cause célèbre in the way that other colonized parts of the world have been and are. And so I think, my desire to foreground Papuan stories of trauma has been a way of making space for stories that are so rarely heard. And that's not to say the stories from the other side don't matter. I just think I had the privilege to be party to those that have generally and continue to be invisibilized under sort of, including in the media and so forth. People like Maria are doing an incredible amount of work to bring to the public gaze. But I think that's why I've chosen to delve into those stories and try to do justice to those stories.
Maria, do you want to add anything, or?
Being Papuan, I experienced 3 major characteristics of trauma: fear, anger, and shame. My mother taught me to sing this Papuan independence song, Hai Tanahku Papua. I only have claim the liberty to be able to sing it out loud. I was taught when I was 8, 9, I could only able to sing it out loud for myself, not even for the world, for myself. I could only started to sing it about 2 years ago. Just to be able to sing that song. Fear, anger, and shame. And I remember also reading Sophie's research. She talks about this anger, this fear and shame brought by this development narrative, brought in by that. And I think this is something I've been, it's been embedded in the way I see myself and in the way I see others. I don't know how many of you know well West Papua, especially after they've been granted special autonomy law that give us access to funding and all that. Suddenly, the issue, oh, you are migrant and you're non-migrant and all of that became big thing. That never happened before. Half of me is migrant. My mom never feels migrant until she was pointed so. And this is how I see this trauma embedded in me and in the society where I've been part of. And as Paulo Freire, the Brazilian popular educator said it very clear, that trauma manifested both in the life of the oppressors as well as the oppressed. And working and liberation, it's about working with the oppressed, not for them.
Those were my questions I wanted to ask, so I'm asking everybody. But you don't have to respond to them. It's just, how can radical care challenge? How might it be used to, how can our care be used to maintain situations of injustice, actually? And what are we survivors of? Really, how can we name our trauma in order to reclaim ourselves as survivors rather than victims, what Maria was talking about? And then what both Sophie and Maria were talking about how can we make space to talk about our grief, our dreams, our stories, bringing that unconscious to the surface. They just felt like those were the three questions that came through for me.
You look like you had something you wanted to say, Mark, before.
Yes, what Sophie was saying about the way that the Marind people relate to the palm oil plant. I was thinking that there's perhaps a lesson there for us in the way that we think about, talk about people in positions of power in our society. I mean, Trump was the obvious one. There was an inability to see him as a victim of the system. And I think what Eva was saying about our politicians in this country being sent away to public schools and having no affection shown to them and so on, I think that that's true of so many people who rise to the top. I think we have a system that basically, I don't like to label, but it seems that sociopaths do very well in our system. And even that label in itself is some sort of admonishment rather than a recognition of what they've been through that brought them to the point. Charles Eisenstein talks about when we look at somebody and say, "Oh, I wouldn't have done that if I was in your position," and how that is always untrue. Because if you had been through the life experiences that that person had been through, you would have done exactly the same thing. That's why they have done what they've done. And I think there's a real separation to be made between the role and the person. Especially in our Western society, where, yeah, the banker goes home and loves his kids at the weekend and is a person. And it's very easy to forget that. And I think that we could learn from the Marind people who are trying to understand the oil palm. And I think that's all I want to say.
I think for me, yeah, I completely agree. And I guess my caution around it is just not to put too much energy in that direction. I feel the need to kind of understand it, but my allegiance is with people who have been shat on in more obvious ways. And I do think there's also, it's, I think for a lot of us who've grown up with privilege in systems of domination, it's a hard job to unpick because we have so many blind spots to the way that we wield our privilege, to the way that we take advantage of our position within the system of, stratified system. and we're often doing harm without intending to, or without realizing it. And we can be very sensitive if people point it out. And that's the whole kind of really difficult dynamic with Black Lives Matter and the kind of white supremacy narrative that's happening. It's important, and I sometimes think it's very understandably brought very harshly. But I think it's so important that you know, anyone with any privilege within any system really attends to that in themselves, while also putting work into trying to bring this system down safely, because it will fall down at some point soon, and it will squish a lot of people. And I feel like it's our job to see to what extent we can try to dismantle it in a managed way, rather than just waiting for it to fail, because that's, you know, that is one way out, but it's not a pretty one. Anyone else with thoughts on that, or other thoughts?
Also feel free to use the chat if you find it hard to turn on your mic. Odette wrote in the chat that it reminds her of the concepts of transformative justice and restorative justice.
And I remember speaking to somebody who I was hoping would join us in this week, but who hasn't been able to, Tom Henfrey. And we were talking about this kind of thing, and he was talking about, you know, the need for some sort of process, you know, almost like a kind of truth and reconciliation process around colonization, really a kind of global process to really acknowledge the harm that was done, the harm that has been done and is still being done in, you know, a slightly different disguise. You know, that's needed. That has to happen at some point, because it's part of addressing the trauma. Paul.
Sorry, it's a slightly different line of thought, but one of the things which stood out in Sophie's talk was about how time had stopped with the plantations coming. And it's like, I'm just pondering now, it's like, are we ourselves living in stopped time? Because we've become disconnected completely. It's like centuries ago. So it's like we've replaced it with maybe an artificial version, the clock time or whatever, but it's maybe we need to start thinking about rediscovering time or something. I don't know. I don't know. It's just thoughts coming to my head. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
That really resonates with me. Sorry, Teresa, you wanted to say something.
Just that we have half a minute left. So.
All right. And it just reminds me of something that I heard Pat McCabe, who's brilliant, say about the Western view of cause and response, cause and reaction, and how for them it's not linear in the way we see it, but that the future is actually making the present be as it is as well. So that idea that we move with our baggage towards the front is not something that is kind of part of their functioning and cosmology. And I just found it so amazingly liberating.
Just on that, there's a culture that believe that the future is behind us and the past is in front of us. It just rang a bell. I don't remember the details, but
I think it's the Maori in New Zealand that walk like looking at the past and with their back to the future.
We are doing things in an open way and transparent, and the chaos is to be seen rather than to be hidden. So yeah. Really, anybody want to say anything last and then pass it back to Sophie and to Maria? Patrick, you look like you are unmuted.
Well, just to say, wonderful to hear. Sophia and Maria. Like I haven't, Maria, it's a decade, it's more since I've heard you talk, and wonderful to hear your, I'm learning about you and learning about your family, and thank you so much. And then about your understanding of grief and oppression and the work that we're all doing. So thank you so much. And yeah, Sophie, I've known of your work with the Marind, but it was wonderful to hear you talk about it and talk about their lived experience of, you know, of how, well, from their side, what their world entails and what the coming of Orpam means to them, and really insightful. So thank you so much.
Great. So you have 1 minute each, or you don't have to say anything. But I just, well, in case Sophie or Maria, you had any, we haven't got time to ask you questions. It was just your storytelling was really powerful, really, really impactful and wonderful. Partly why I needed a bit of space out. It's like, that's very strong medicine you're giving us, but really powerful and healing medicine, felt to me. So if either of you want to say anything to wrap up, I mean, you've already said lots, but if you have anything you want to say.
Maria duluan. I'll just quickly jump in. Thank you so much for those kind words, Patrick. And I mean, I think I'm also a little bit, you never get used to telling these stories, Justin. That's the thing, you know, every time I try to do them justice again, something new and different comes out of it. And it's the storytelling, right? Stories. And every time an opportunity like this arises to be in conversation, stories, world, other worlds. So thank you for making this space possible. I think if there's, you know, I was thinking about your question on radical care, and for me, there's, you know, the incredible complexity and nuance of the stories that Marind tell about their own changing worlds as philosophers of their own changing worlds is in itself a resistance. It's a refusal to flatten realities to a human-only, capital-only narrative, a colonial one at that. It's a refusal to let go of multiplicity and ambiguity and uncertainty and speculation, and that is, you know, that is an epistemic resistance to the flattening, singularizing, homogenizing, racializing logic of colonial capitalism. And just for that, I think those stories are deeply and always will be political. So thank you for this space to share them, and I hope I've done them justice.
Maria, do you have anything you want to say before we finish? You don't have to, but if you have anything you'd like to say. You're on mute if you're...
I think I am just honoring this space and the people here. I've met Patrick a long time ago. I've been to his house and know his family. So it's such a, it's really, really good opportunity, you know, to be here and to share this and to make new friends and to see, you know, and to hear that this is basically not something that we have this opportunity to talk openly about colonization and what it does, not just to the Marind people in Papua, but what actually did it do to us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, we're going to say goodbye because we try to finish on time, even if we get everything else mucked up on the way through, or I do, sorry. So thank you so much, both of you, really wonderful, and thanks everybody else for being here.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thanks,
Ciao.
Justin. Thanks, Eva. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Sophie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dad.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.